So allow me to introduce Dr. Martha Burns. She is a joint appointment professor at Northwestern University and has authored 3 books and over 100 journal articles on the neuroscience of language and communication. Dr. Burns' expertise is in all areas related to the neuroscience of learning, such as language and reading in the brain, the bilingual brain, the language to literacy continuum, and the adolescent brain. She is a fellow of the American Speech Language Hearing Association, and she is the director of neuroscience education at Scientific Learning Corporation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Martha Burns.
Thank you so much, Hallie, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you could attend. Before we get started, what really helps me is to understand who you all are and to know a little bit about my audience. So what you see on the screen is a question. Tell us about you. What's your interest in attending the webinar? And then just take your cursor and click on the dot that would correspond. I'm going to click on Other. Just so you can see that. I'm a parent of a child with reading struggles. I'm a private practice professional or educator, or I'm a public school educator or administrator. Click or something else. So I clicked on something else. Click on what's appropriate for you and press the Submit button. And then what we'll do is see who we have here. So this is great for me because what I understand now is that the vast majority of you, 2/3 of you, are public school educators or administrators. Few of you, about a quarter of you, are in private practice, professionals or educators, and then we have a few parents. So that's just great, and then a few others, perhaps psychologists or others interested in this area. So with that, let's get started with an understanding of how the brain is organized for reading. This is a slide that came from an article by Stanislaus Dehaene that was just published last year. And I like it because it shows you really what we call the main network, both for language and then reading, which becomes superimposed on language. So what you're looking at, first of all, is in the temporal lobe. You can see that popped up there. You're looking at regions that develop through brain mapping. And we're going to talk about those brain maps in a few minutes. But those maps form in the brain in young children from birth till they get to school, the temporal lobe maps, and they represent each speech sound of whatever the child's native language is. And if a child has 2 languages, they're going to be 2 maps. Then what you see down at the bottom, it says visual word form area. And that's written in green, and that is an area at the very bottom of the brain in the occipital lobe that's going to be mapped for letters of whatever you're going to read. In English, it's going to be English letters, but in other languages, it might be other kinds of symbols. And that becomes mapped after a child goes to school. And those 2 areas have to become linked together. So you can see there's an arrow there, a big kind of curved arrow. It has a name. It's actually called the arcuate fasciculus. You can see over there on the right. And that's going to join those 2 together. Now, in the frontal lobe, we have regions that allow you to speak, so they support spoken language and verbal fluency, being able to talk quickly and easily and come up with words quickly and easily. Very important for grammar and very important for what we call working memory, the capacity to hold information in your mind and to keep it in your mind and keep revising it as new information comes in. And that's why it's called working memory, because you're always revising it. And then, as I said, you're going to have this link, this big black arrow there that you see, that's going to link the temporal lobe to the occipital lobe, and that's going to form over time, and that's going to enable a child to link speech sounds and their speech sound map, like the p and the t and the k, with the letters that correspond to that. All of that has to form over time, and if any one of those areas doesn't mature as easily, then reading is difficult, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I want to start with a historical view that many of you might be aware of called the double deficit hypothesis. I like to start with this simply because it's a theory of Marianne Wolf's. She first wrote about it in 1999, so that's now almost 18 years ago. And what she said, it's very well regarded. We have a lot of research that supports it and has supported it over that last 17 to 18 years. And what that kind of approach looked at was that you could have weaknesses in verbal fluency, which she referred to as rapid auditory naming, being able to come up with words quickly and easily, or you could have problems with phonological awareness, the ability to perceive speech sounds and be able to know that a word like book has 3 sounds in it. B, k. We call that segmenting a word into sounds, as you probably all well know, or to know that the word book and the word back start with the same sound, or the word book and the word look end with the same sound in rhyme. So all of those, of course, are phonological awareness skills. And the research has supported over many, many years now, certainly 15 to 20, that phonological awareness and this verbal fluency are core components of dyslexia. And the other issue that has come up since Marianne Wolf first proposed her is that brain structure and white matter tracks, that arrow that I just showed you that was called the arcuate fasciculus, relating to phonological awareness and to this verbal fluency, that we know that those measures of track organization must underlie these skills. But the research for a long time wasn't able to show that. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is the new research that we have, kind of pulling this all together and adding a couple of more dimensions of this. Now, what I'm going to do is update you on research that was published in August of this year. So it's only really a couple of months old in a journal called Behavioral Sciences. And the whole issue of that journal in August of this year was to update us on understanding how our brain supports reading and language and mathematics. So there are lots of articles on lots of different areas. But what I'm going to share with you is the newer research on reading and dyslexia per se. And what we now know, if we summarize that research, is there are several risk factors that contribute to reading problems or dyslexia in children. One is definitely genetics. We know that dyslexia per se tends to be inherited, so that if a child has dyslexia, very often we will see a parent who may say, yes, I had trouble learning to read, or an uncle or an aunt or a sister or brother. And we've known it runs in families, and there's been genetic research showing what genes might place a child at risk for having trouble learning to read. We know that there are brain level differences in terms of how those areas I just showed you mature, and we'll talk about that. We know there are also perceptual and cognitive level differences, and I want to explain what I mean by that and what this particular group of authors meant by that. That children can have different ways of perceiving. So some children find perceiving speech sounds, for example, more difficult than other children. It just isn't as easy for them. There could be other sensory motor kinds of perceptual differences. Children might have little trouble perceiving letters, for example. We also know that we can have children who have difficulty learning language. Language just isn't their strong suit, and learning language is slower for them. Or they might have attentional issues, so that they develop just fine, they've got great motor skills, they're very bright kids, but they have trouble paying attention. And then especially if they have trouble paying attention either when they're reading or looking at letters, or if they're having trouble paying attention and sustaining it when they're listening, that can lead to reading problems. And then we can have, as we already know from the past research in the dual deficit hypothesis, we can have problems with phonological awareness, that children, they can learn language and they know it well, but they don't rhyme very well, and they can't seem to parse words into sounds, or they might have trouble with working memory. They have just trouble holding things in their mind for a long period of time, or they might have trouble with this rapid auditory naming, being very fluent, or even recognizing letters, or there just might be other issues like vocabulary. And then finally, we know that there are environmental factors that contribute to this. We know that children who come from homes with low socioeconomic levels, low-income homes, have more trouble very often with learning to read. Sometimes it appears that that's because their world is very different. They come from a world that's more stressful. They come from a world where they don't have as much language exposure. We've known that for quite a while. We know that stress can affect learning to read, and we know that if a child doesn't have effective education, that can affect how they learn to read. Now, these brain level differences, this is a slide that's quite hard and complex to go through, but I just want to explain what these brain level differences are for you. I know it's hard to see, but you can get access to these slides and be able to look at it more closely later. But number one, what researchers have found in the last few years is that the cortex itself in children who are learning to read and children who are struggling to learn to read are differences. Now, the cortex is the outer layer of the brain that contains brain cells and dendrites. So it's the layer of the brain that makes all the little connections. And those areas of the brain are different in children who are struggling to learn to read. Now, it doesn't mean that they are not as smart. It doesn't have anything to do with intelligence, because they may have other areas of the brain that are much thicker and much more well-developed. But those areas of the cortex just don't seem to be the same in children who have dyslexia. That's on that upper left-hand corner. Then what we see is when we look at what we call functional activation, when you do a brain scan, we call it functional magnetic resonance imaging of adults or children who have dyslexia or reading problems, we see that the brain doesn't light up the same way when they're doing even a rhyming task. And we've had that research since Elise Temple, actually, at John Gabrielli's lab in 2000. So we've known that for a good 15 to 16 years, that the children's brain just isn't as active in the same way if they're struggling with reading. We also know that arrow that I showed you, that arcuate fasciculus, doesn't seem to mature in the same way. The white matter is maturing differently in children who are struggling to read, which would make sense because those are the fiber tracts that are the highways of the brain that are going to build brain linkages, so one part of the brain can connect to the other. So let's get at the factors in pre-readers, the new research on what can we identify in a young child before they even read that would help us to identify a child who may struggle to read and then to know what to do about it. That's really why you're all here. So this was another article from that excellent update that came out just in August. Vandermosten, and its theories of causes of dyslexia based on research with children who are at high risk. And these are going to be children who have parents who had reading problems or who have siblings who have reading problems. And what the authors did is they looked at all the research. So they did what's called a meta-analysis review. They looked at all the research out there on risk factors. And the focus was on specifically what are the neurological differences, and can we see that in children who are quite young before they ever start learning to read, because that would help us understand causes. And we were looking specifically, or the authors were looking specifically at that this view that there's a phonological component to having trouble learning to read, especially phonological awareness. People who have studied what we call the orthographic causes or presumed causes of dyslexia, that is trouble reading letters and recognizing letters. And then the students who might have these, or children who might have these lower level perceptual or attention problems. So the researchers looked at and summarized all that research. And what you see in this slide is the differences, if you just generalize them now, that are associated with children before they ever start to learn to read, that we know contribute to reading problems when the children are followed longitudinally and then they go on to present with problems with reading. And those areas are those two I kind of highlighted for you. The red one that you see there, which is the area of the brain, it's often referred to as the temporal occipital junction, but it is the area that's going to allow a child to link that sound map to the letter map. And then that blue circle that you see in the bottom is the area that helps you learn to recognize letters, and that starts becoming mapped usually after children are in school. But you can even see in pre-readers sometimes who are at risk for reading and reading problems, and you can see the two studies that are listed there, 14 and 19. Those studies showed these children have a different arcuate fasciculus, and this area is different when they're young, even before they start to read. And then there are a couple of areas in the right hemisphere, not as big, not as much research, but showing up. So if we summarize the findings then, and I'm just taking a quote from a Vandermosten research just that came out, the summary is that these findings of similar anomalies in at-risk pre-readers, and then you follow them up to dyslexia, compared to children who never develop problems with reading, provide the first evidence that it is the brain differences observed in children and adults with dyslexia, and that dyslexia is not experience-driven. So it isn't what's going on in the home, it isn't what's going on in terms of the environment, but it is related to brain differences in the way the brains process information differently. And so if we summarize all of this, then we can say that there are multiple reasons a child could have trouble learning to read. Number one, they could have a problem with phonological issues. They could have trouble learning to perceive speech sounds. They could have trouble learning to rhyme and learning to segment words into sounds. They could have an orthographic issue. They could have trouble learning to recognize letters, to be able to identify the written patterns. And I should say that if it's phonological, it would be due to differences in the way the temporal parietal region is maturing. If it's orthographic, it would be differences in the way the occipital temporal area of the brain, that visual word form area would be developing. And then finally, we have the perceptual deficit and support for that based on 20 years of research that came out of Rutgers University and University of California in San Francisco, that yes, we can also have lower level deficits. We can have problems that precede rhyming and that actually lead to problems with phonology. One, it could be working memory, it could be the inability to perceive speech sounds, or it might be visual perceptual problems. So let's look at perception, and let's look especially at auditory perception, because that's what supports this whole phonological understanding of reading problems. Let's look at how the brain maps itself for sound. First, we're going to look at how the brain maps itself for sound in animal studies, because that was the first research that was ever done. This was research that was done at University of California in San Francisco with animals. And what you're looking at in the first picture here is an animal. You're looking at their auditory cortex, and what you're seeing is an animal that is 16 days old. That's what P16 stands for. And all the gray cells are auditory cells. They're cells that respond to sound in the brain, but they're not lighting up yet. The brain is going to have to become mapped for sound. Now, these animals are listening to animal sounds, and by the time they're 22 days of age, you can see what that rainbow of colors is pitch, or like on a piano keyboard. Red would be high notes, blue would be low notes. So by the time the animal's 22 days of age, you can see that their auditory cortex, their listening part of their brain, is becoming mapped for high sounds, low sounds, woof, meow, and all sorts of, roar. The roar of a lion would be a low sound. The tweet of a bird would be a high sound. And this animal's brain is wiring for that after they're born from just a few days of age until they become adults. Now, we couldn't see it in human beings for a long time, but there have been a couple of studies, the most recent one done by Mesgarani et al. That was just published a couple of years ago, where they actually went in, put electrodes on the surface of adults' brains before they went through neurosurgery for other reasons, and they mapped out on the temporal lobe, and there you can see those red dots on that temporal lobe, the listening part of the human brain, and each of those dots corresponds to a letter, and you can see the letters over on the chart on the right. They're a little hard to see, but if you look at D, you can just look down on the left-hand side. You can see all the phonemes of the English language, and you can see each of those dots corresponds to one of those phonemes, and that's how we map for sounds. Now, let's look at some of the early research on this perception of speech sounds as a risk for reading problems. Here you're looking at a study that you see at the bottom that was an fMRI study of pre-readers. So these are 3- and 4-year-olds at risk for dyslexia. And what it showed was when they looked at the children inside of a scanner while they're doing rhyming tasks and other kinds of tasks, you can see that children had trouble with processing auditory stimuli. That means they couldn't perceive it very well, and that eventually that phonological awareness skills correlated with this activation, but the activation on a task where they had to perceive sounds changing very quickly, and we call that a rapid auditory processing task. And that was the first research you can see published in 2014 using fMRI with pre-readers that supported that there's a link to reading ability that is through this perceptual process. And then we had a longitudinal study. You can see that here in 2014, Clark et al. It followed pre-readers, and it followed them for several years. So first they identified perceptual weaknesses, and then it followed those children to see, do they in fact go on, if they had some problems with perception of speech sounds, did they in fact go on to have difficulty later on learning to read? And what they found was, you can see that in the third dot, that the MRI measures of cortical thickness at pre-reading age then corresponded or correlated in those children who just developed dyslexia later on. And so that research then started to support this idea that had been around for several years, that these perceptual problems may underlie at least a large majority of children who go on to have trouble learning to read. Then just last year, in the Journal of the American Speech Language and Hearing Association Research Journal, it's called JSHR, and you can see that article at the bottom, and they actually Lockman et al., Chrisman, Lockman, and Steinbrink actually also looked at auditory processing deficits, and they looked at them in children who were pre-readers, and they looked at them to see if in general those impairments would lead to dyslexia later on. And they found, yes, in fact, in many cases they did. Then a colleague of mine at Northwestern University, Nina Kraus, and her colleagues actually looked at a very specific kind of perceptual problem, the ability of children to perceive speech in noise. And again, they looked at children when they were very young. This was just published last year also. They looked at children when they were young, just playing with toys, and they had this little bathing cap on. The children didn't have to go through a scanner or do something purposeful in a machine or anything. They just were playing with toys, and this bathing cap recorded whether they were perceiving a sound that was being pumped into the sound field while they were playing. So they might hear da, 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 but sometimes that sound had noise in the background, so it would have sounded more like this, or da, 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 with the noise. And what they found is that children who went on to develop problems with phonological awareness and then trouble reading did have trouble perceiving speech sounds, especially in noise. So the conclusions of all of this recent research just over the last couple of years, and I'm summarizing Vandermosten et al. That just came out in August, the most consistent findings across studies are differences in the left temporal parietal area between at-risk pre-readers and controls, the area that supports and maps for speech sounds and then enables you to perceive the speech sounds and do phonological awareness tasks. Because this left temporal parietal area is associated with phonological processing, then it does provide support for the phonological deficit theory. But we do also see differences in the occipital temporal region, that visual word form area prior to reading onset. And finally, we have some evidence provided that there's an early deficit in perceptual regions, especially in the auditory domain. So if we summarize all of this, then the new approach to dyslexia and to reading problems is to think of it as not having a single cause or a single factor, but what's called a multi-deficit approach to dyslexia. And it's now considered the most accurate way to understand causes. That, yes, you can have environmental factors. Yes, there are genetic influences. Yes, there seems to be a perceptual core to these problems. And then there are differences in brain level. And any one of these can contribute to difficulties learning to read. The implications then for educators and for our educational practice and policy is to think of this as a multi-deficit kind of issue and to address each of these issues in our educational policy, but also understand neuroscience and what neuroscience can contribute to building up these different areas of the brain and building up the capacity, the underlying capacity to learn language. So there was a meta-analysis published last year, and they looked at this neuroscience research then to say, okay, is that useful to educators? And do we have neuroscience-based approaches that we can utilize to help us to identify and to help these children build up underlying capacities for reading even before they would get into school and perhaps have problems reading, but definitely after they have problems as well? And what the authors concluded was, yes, we have neuroscience research now that demonstrates that we can improve underlying capacities like speech sound perception and working memory and verbal fluency. And when we do that, we can see both changes in brain function and in brain anatomy, as well as changes in reading. So here's another question. As we get into interventions, how familiar are you with interventions for dyslexia? Do you consider yourself an expert? Do you know some of the information? Or do you feel like, I'm kind of here to learn some. I really don't feel like I know a lot. Press the button that you feel is most appropriate, and then click on the Submit button. And most of you are saying yes. I feel like about 60% of you say yes, I feel like I know a lot. But some of you are saying, no, this is really new to me. I really don't know much. So let's look now at a very broad-based intervention that gets at all of these capacities, these regions of the brain that we want to look at, and that exercises those regions to build up a child's capacity to learn to read. This is a slide. This was a slide done at John Gabrielli's lab with fMRIs in 2003. And what you can see here, and then he summarized it again in an article he wrote in 2008, so I listed both those references. But on the left, you see children doing a phonological awareness task. They're actually rhyming in an fMRI scanner, and you can see the two circled areas are those areas that we've been talking about. One is the frontal lobe, the area important for rapid auditory naming, for grammar, for verbal fluency, and the other circled area on the left you see is that temporal parietal junction area, so important for mapping letters to sounds. And what you see on the right-hand side is 35 children who had been diagnosed as dyslexic, who are second graders. They're doing the same phonological awareness task, rhyming task, and you see those areas are just not lighting up. But after they went through just 6 to 8 weeks of the Fast Forward program, they did it very intensively. What you can see is it's a broad-based program that works on all these areas, that those areas lit up, those two areas. You can see the frontal lobe area circled in the front. You can see that temporal parietal area circled in the back. But notice something else. Notice the visual word form area is also lighting up. So the three core areas that we now know identify children who are struggling to learn to read can be enhanced through neuroscience interventions that are broad-based. And we also know from the environmental research that the sooner the children learn to read, the better. So this is research that Stanislaus Dehaene published just last year in an article called Illiterate to Literate, just showing how the sooner you learn to read, the more you activate those parts of the brain that are important, not just for reading, but the parts of the brain important for learning in a classroom, and the parts of the brain important for remembering what you've learned and what you've read. So learning to read early and effectively is important. And we also know, and Stanislaus Dehaene has published this, that through exercising of reading, you build up that fiber tract, that arcuate fasciculus that's so important for reading skill later on. So if we look at another group of children now, this is another study that was published, and I know this is a very, very busy slide for all of you and hard to see, but I did want to copy it as it was, because I want you to see what the research shows on what we call resilience. And what you're looking at on the left are all the studies that have been done on children who were identified as struggling readers, who ended up being able to read well. And what you can see over on the right, I know it's small, but you'll see almost all the studies said if children have good oral language skills, that enables them to become good readers, even if they have some of these risk factors. And then what you see in this chart, again, the studies are listed on the left, kind of a relevant finding discussion in the middle. But what you see on the right, on this particular slide, is that children who are resilient and did become good readers, even though they had the risk factors, also had good awareness of what we call morphology. They were very good with grammar. They understood grammar. They had rich vocabularies, and so they had good language skills. So when children have good language skills, that seems to help them overcome some of the risk factors that might lead to dyslexia. So an excellent approach to reading intervention then would be one that builds speech sound perception, also focuses intensively on oral language skills, provides instruction on grammar and what we call morphology, word endings, suffixes, prefixes, improves vocabulary, and works on verbal reasoning. If we could have exercises that build all of those at the same time, that would provide a comprehensive way to help children who are either at risk for having reading problems or presenting with reading problems after they're in school. So let's just ask your final poll question. Are you already using an intervention for dyslexia? You might say yes, you might say no, you might say sort of. We're kind of doing traditional reading activities or tutoring. Press the submit button. We'll take a look. Almost all of you have an intervention you're using. So let me just give you an idea of how you could, let's say, exacerbate your outcomes with that reading intervention, how you could improve it with a short-term, intervention, neuroscience-based intervention, which would get at these other issues, which would get at oral language, which would get at speech sound perception, which would get at understanding grammar. And what I'm going to review for you then is the Fast Forward products. They're not a substitute for reading interventions that you're using, but they certainly can augment them and make them go faster and work better. And you can get at all these brain areas very quickly and efficiently, as you saw in that Temple research. So the Fast Forward products build, as you can see on the left in blue, it says oral language skills. They build and emphasize perceptual skills, and they do all of this within a context of underlying cognitive skills like attention and working memory, or with reading products in the underlying context of actual reading materials. And when you use them, if you use them intensively, you can start to get results very, very quickly. You can start accelerating learning and reading, and also classroom learning over 8 weeks in some cases if you do very intensive programs. If you do less intensive, let's say half an hour a day or an hour a day, 50 minutes a day, 5 days a week, you're getting into 16 weeks, 20 weeks, but you can start really accelerating learning very quickly. And I just want to show you this particular format isn't good for showing demos, unfortunately, but I can describe what goes on in the program, and then you can go to the Scientific Learning website and actually go click on a demo tab and be able to do these demos yourself. But I'll explain what happens. So the Fast Forward program have exercises like this one that you see called Hoop Nut, where the student presses on that spaceship that you see in the lower left-hand corner, and the acorns are going to say sounds. So first the student might hear something when they press the spaceship. They might hear something like Abba, or the planet, actually, that yellow planet, and they'll hear Abba. And then one of the acorns will probably go Ada, and one of the acorns will go Abba, and they have to remember which one matched. And they're going to do that thousands of times, and they're going to get all the different speech sounds that are important for reading. So they're going to be able to do bay and day, and they'll hear ba and da, or they might hear sa and za, and they're going to hear the speech sounds and build up their capacity to perceive them. So that's designed as a matching task to build up perceptual skills, speech sound perception skills. Now, this particular exercise is another one that builds speech sound perceptual skills, but it also builds attention at the same time. In this case, what happens when the child clicks on that planet, what they're going to do is see a word. So they might see the word book, for example, and then they're going to hear words or see words fly across the page, like bat and book and big. And when that one matches the one that they heard, the target one, they click it on. So they have to pay attention and maintain their attention and remember what they heard. So it builds both attention and speech sound perception. This is an exercise where each of these speakers is going to have a different word that the child hears, and they're going to be very similar. So one speaker might say bat, and the next speaker might say mat, and the next speaker might say fat. And they're going to click on those speakers. They won't see the words, and then they have to find one down somewhere later that matches the one that they clicked. So if they hear fat, bat, mat, fat, they have to go back to the one where they heard fat and click it on, and then they have to find mat, and then they have to find bat. And so that works speech sound perception and memory at the same time. This is an exercise that builds morphology skills, the ability to understand grammar. So in this case, the child might have an exercise that says something like cat, show me cat, then show me cats. Show me he is running, show me he ran. And the child will work very systematically through grammatical constructions and gradually learn all the grammatical constructions of the English language. Great for any children that have problems with grammar or have developmental language problems. All of these exercises children are getting all at the same time. And so here you just see some research from Mechanicville, New York, that shows if you look at children and their oral language skills before and after the Fast Forward program. On the left, you're looking at oral language fluency, improved fluency with the dibbles. On the right, you're looking at oral language skills on something called the CELF, the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals. You find after Fast Forward that these language skills, language comprehension improves, as well as verbal fluency. Now, when you get into the reading products, the children actually have passages that they read, but again, the passages that they read and the exercises they do are going to be geared toward phonological awareness skills, or geared toward learning grammatical skills, and or geared toward learning vocabulary, and or geared toward learning to comprehend paragraphs and get main ideas and details. So you're building up all of this capacity at the same time for these underlying language, perceptual skills, phonological awareness skills, and reading comprehension. And if we look at another school district, Palmyra, Pennsylvania, and you look at their basic reading proficiency, you see that after they went through the Fast Forward program, this was in 2011, before and after, you see that their proficiency in a lot of the skills, we had many more proficient readers. You can see that in the third area there, the third bar graph, and many more advanced readers than you did in the green before they went through Fast Forward example. And we know that the results endure over time. So we have school districts now who have been using us for many years, and we see that the results that they got 2 years ago or 3 years ago are continuing to show themselves in their reading skills. So we also have scientific learning as something called Reading Assistant that builds language fluency, where the students, after they build these language skills, after they build the perceptual skills, after they build the understanding of morphology, after they get their phonological awareness, you can actually have them read aloud. You can have them read aloud into a computer. The computer has speech recognition software, so it'll recognize if they read correctly and help them. It'll be guided reading if they don't. It will guide them and help them if they make a mistake. And through Reading Assistant, we can also improve all of that verbal fluency as well. So that's the end of our talk. We have just a few minutes here for questions. I'm happy to take your questions, and Hallie will come on with the questions that you have. To get these slides and to be able to see the demos, you can go to the Scientific Learning website, which is www.scientificlearning.com. To actually get the slides themselves, you can also go to webinars at scilearn.com. And if you submit your questions now, Hallie, I will answer them for people.
Yes, so we will be sending an email out tomorrow with a link to the slides, a link to the recording, a link to the certificate. And we've been getting lots of really good questions, very thoughtful questions from the audience, and it's been hard to try to prioritize which ones to have you answer. So one question was, are we assuming that dyslexia is the cause of all reading problems? In other words, would the strategies used in this training be for any student with reading problems?
Yes, the strategies would be for any child with reading problems, because I think what the research is starting to support is that reading problems have these multi-factors that can contribute to them. It can be problems with phonological awareness. It can be problems with perception. It can be problems with language. All of those areas can contribute to reading problems. For a child to pass over the threshold to be diagnosed as dyslexic, their scores are going to have to be at a significant level below the norm. But all the research so far is looking at reading problems in general or children diagnosed with dyslexia and showing exactly the same patterns. So what is good for a child who has a diagnosis of dyslexia, it turns out building the same skills in a child who's a struggling reader but may not have that diagnosis would be just as effective.
Great. The next question is a question we get on Facebook a lot, which is, what's the difference between your program and Orton Gillingham?
Oh, good question. So Orton-Gillingham is a wonderful intervention. It's been around for probably 40 years now, I would say, and it's based on phonics instruction. And we do have research. We have some very nice research that's come out from various research organizations showing that phonological awareness is the best way, or a phonics-based approach is the best way to teach reading to children. It activates the parts of the brain that are important for reading and reading well. And it also is a wonderful way to teach reading to a child who's struggling. But what Orton-Gillingham can't do as easily is build up general language skills, understanding of morphology. What Orton-Gillingham, because it's a phonics-based reading approach, doesn't do is build up the perceptual skills for language. If it does it indirectly. What Orton-Gillingham doesn't necessarily work on directly is auditory attention or auditory memory. So by using Orton-Gillingham but supplementing with Fast Forward, you can really get at all the issues. You use Orton-Gillingham approaches to teach reading. You use Fast Forward to enable the student to be able to learn to benefit from that instruction.
And sort of a related question, and a separate person asked, do you suggest Fast Forward be used as the only intervention, which you kind of just answered, but do you want to speak to that?
Yes. So when a child has a reading issue, I want them to have a good instructional system, and I think Orton-Gillingham is an excellent instructional system. And Fast Forward does not teach reading. It builds the underlying capacities that enable a child who's struggling to read to learn easily. So the answer is no. You wouldn't just use Fast Forward all by itself. You would combine Fast Forward with a good instructional program like Orton-Gillingham programs.
Great. This is a fairly straightforward one. What age do people begin diagnosing dyslexia?
Well, you can see from the slides that I presented that many researchers are starting to identify risk factors in children as young as 3 or 4. Nina Kraus, for example, at Northwestern University feels that her methodology, she is able to identify children in preschool long before they begin to read. I would say generally dyslexia is not diagnosed in most clinics or centers or schools, though, until after children are in school. But hopefully we'll see more and more centers be able to identify children at risk for dyslexia quite early, 3 years of age, 4 years of age.
Okay, great. This question came from a speech pathologist, but I think it applies to other educators as well. And the question is, what suggestions are there for which types of assessments speech pathologists or any educator should administer to make sure we are looking at all areas that we need to help a child with dyslexia?
Wow, that's a $4,000 question. Sorry, there's another call coming in. That's why I'm getting that little click, but hopefully you can hear me. So I think the important thing to help administrators is to share this research with them, to share the research that shows this what I'm going to call this multi-deficit approach to understanding dyslexia, and these are brand new articles, but they are available. You can go online and get them and share them with administrators to show them there are environmental factors, there are risk factors in terms of perceptual and cognitive skills and attention skills, and there are language issues, and that all of these need to be addressed in these children, and that if we address all of them, these children can learn. They can be successful readers.
All right, thank you. How effective is the program for children who are identified as being dyslexic when they come into secondary school, so around 12 years old?
Some of our best results, and again, if you go to the website, scientificlearning.com, and click on the research tab, you can actually look up research for secondary students directly. But some of our best results, interestingly, are with older students, middle school students and high school students. There was a great study done, by the way, by Selena Fisher in New Rochelle, New York, which is a suburban urban school district. And she did it just with middle school students who had been diagnosed as having learning disabilities, so they were in special ed. And she used Fast Forward for the first time with them when they were 7th and 8th graders, and showed dramatic improvements in their reading skills and in their learning achievement in general, academic achievement in general in school. One of the reasons it seems to be effective, just so you know, as an aside with older students, is that the adolescent brain goes through a second period that we call a critical period. Adolescence, we used to think that most of the brain development occurred in young children before they went to school and early school years. But we now know there's a second period when the brain is very plastic and where it's very malleable, if you will. It changes dramatically, and that's adolescence. So you can actually use a neuroscience-based program. You can target that adolescent group very effectively.
Great. I always think, I've been at Scientific Learning for more than 17 years now, that is a particular group that makes multiple 5-6 years of progress. You know, just anecdotal reports are really impressive. And what about whether the program has been tested with children who have kind of co-conditions, so co-occurring conditions like speech apraxia and dyslexia, or slow processing speed and fine motor skill problems with dyslexia? All the above.
Okay, all right, so that's a really good question. The more issues a child has, obviously, the more challenges we have as educators. And we want to make sure that those children are getting all of the services that they need. So if a child has some fine motor issues, that's going to affect their writing as well as their learning to read. If a child has social emotional issues, it's going to affect language and behavior in a classroom. So whenever we have these multiple kinds of factors, the important thing is to keep in mind that this child's brain is malleable, that all children's brains can change, that neuroscience interventions can drive very positive changes in those children's brains, but we want to make sure that we offer the supplemental services that will help in those other areas as well.
Great. Okay. I really like this question. It says, I am worried that some of my pupils with severe dyslexia would not be able to manage to match such subtle differences in sound as you mentioned. Are the exercises graded so pupils can experience success at their personal performance level?
Yes. So that's actually a very, very good question, because what neuroscientists do when they build products like this and design them is they start with the tasks that are they make the task very easy, if you will, for everybody. And then what the programs do is adapt based on how easy it is for someone. So if the very easy exercises are difficult, the speech sound perception, one of the things the neuroscientists did is they exaggerate the sounds. They make them longer and louder, so it's easier to tell the differences between them. Now, that's hard for you and me because we're used to hearing speech sounds that are just very quick and fast. But for the young child, the researchers call that glasses for the ears. It actually enables them for the first time to hear differences. And then the exercises adapt over time so that those exaggerations become less and less and less over time, so that by the time the child's finished, they're hearing speech perfectly normally and making those distinctions. But it will move them gradually, and it will move them at every child's own pace. So if you have 10 children in a room and they're all doing the same exercise, within 2 days you'll see every child at a different level, because the programs are designed to adapt right where that student needs the primary help and move them at their rate.
Okay, we'll take a couple more. These are really, really great questions coming in. So this question is, how does this program help with stealth dyslexia or hidden dyslexia in children whose other abilities compensate for the lower level issues? This is the type of question I ask Dr. Burns when I'm sitting next to her at dinner.
That's a great question. And actually, that research I shared with you on children who are resilient, that's one of the things they were looking at. So one of the things they were looking at is, some children have these risk factors and they eventually do fine in school. what enables them to do that? And those children may surface later on. So they might start out looking like they're reading pretty well, and as whoever asked this, that they have a hidden reading problem. They're really compensating for it extraordinarily well. But by the time often they get to the 5th grade or maybe the 8th grade, all of a sudden they might hit a wall where their compensations aren't working so well anymore because they can't read as quickly and they can't absorb as quickly as the other students. And despite how bright they are, they start having trouble in school. And fast forward is excellent for those students, and I actually have a daughter who presented that way. So she was reading perfectly normally. She had a mother who was a speech pathologist who talked to her nonstop. You can kind of imagine listening to me how much I talk. And all she heard was me talk, and I read to her. And so she got in school and was an excellent reader for many years, and then hit a wall and started to have problems and actually went through the Fast Forward program successfully. Kind of surreptitiously, I've got her on it by having her run some other students, but it helped tremendously. So those students are just can be helped just as much as students who have the more overt problems. And with all students, they're just going to read more easily and absorb what they read much better.
All right, I'm going to round out all of our questions with this last one, which came up actually in conversation last week also. The question is, any idea why English speakers have a much higher likelihood of developing dyslexia?
Why English
speakers have a higher likelihood of developing dyslexia?
Oh, okay. That's an interesting question, and Stanislaus Dehaene is actually a neuroscientist in Scandinavia who's looked at dyslexia in different cultures and different languages quite extensively. And what he's found is it's the same neurological differences, the same brain differences cause reading problems, whether you're having a reading problem in Japanese or in another language. But different cultures and different educational systems diagnose dyslexia differently. In some, they don't even diagnose it at all. There are many cultures where, for example, the Asian cultures where their language is ideographic, so that it isn't alphabetic. And so if they have trouble perceiving the language, it's going to affect them differently than it will affect a child who's trying to read an alphabetic language. So Stanislaus Dehaene, I would take you to his research on that. He has a wonderful book called Reading in the Brain. And in that book, you can get it on Amazon.com, he talks about dyslexia in all different languages and what it looks like and how it presents itself. So that's a wonderful source for that question. And that has been his interest.
All right. We both thank you so much for attending today. Thank you, Dr. Burns. We have a lot of questions that came in, and we will write you all back. So look for that, for the email tomorrow with the link to the recording, and which you can share with colleagues, friends, other parents that you know. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.